Hey team, thanks so much for watching. Welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. And I am going to mainly be concentrating on Richard Barrons' video that I know I've already twice shown you excerpts of, one in a live stream and a little part of that yesterday. But I want to do a kind of reaction to everything he says because I think it's that important before looking at Justin Bronk in a future video and what he says a lot more in the interview with Lord Carroll. I think there's some really important features of both interviews. But before we go to Richard Barrons, I'm going to drop into this Francis Farron. I think he's actually written this as part of the Kyiv Independent article, but he's kind of like done a thread on it here. This is a thread. Well, it starts. The last month has been a bit of a depressing one for Ukraine, especially for those who are here, invested and paying attention rather than cheering on their sports team from afar. I want to inject some clarity into this key point in the war. So a thread here. So Zelensky and Zaluzhny's respective pieces in Western magazines. So we had the Time magazine, and it wasn't by him, but it was about him. And then we had Zaluzhny's piece and essay as well alongside it in The Economist. Have triggered the discussion and the bad vibes about the future, but they all describe things we already knew. This wave of gloom was brought not by the articles, but by two key events. First, the disappointing culmination of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Failing to make gains that change the game strategically to add insult to injury, Russia's capture of the initiative around Avdiivka showed that Moscow is neither short of resources nor of confidence. The caveats apply to that, which is the initial objectives for that counteroffensive were indeed to get to Tokmak and possibly even to the Sea of Azov. But within a week, they're like, that ain't going to happen. And then it all changed from there. So it depends where you take them, what you take the objectives to be. At what point in the counteroffensive you look at those objectives and say, well, that was the objectives, because at the beginning it was one thing, and then a week or two later the objectives have changed because they couldn't do. So you could say it's a failure in the first week, like they failed and they were going to fail to do that 30 kilometers a day advance they were hoping for. It's never going to happen because of all the defenses that were built up in a way that they hadn't anticipated. The sheer volume of mines they had to navigate, whilst the helicopters played a hell of a role. And of course the Ukrainians really wanted ATACMS but weren't given ATACMS until the counteroffensive was over, but they needed them at the beginning of the counteroffensive to take out the Berdyansk airfield where the helicopters operated from. So it was all a bit of not a mess, it was all unachievable at the beginning. And so they had to change their strategy and change their objectives. And after they changed those objectives, as far as I can work out, and this is speculation, it was successful in terms of attrition. Basically, attrition of capacity and in some terms capability. So the capability of the Air Force has been taken away. Now they're having to operate out of Russian national territory rather than occupied territory, and that changes things. And the Black Sea Fleet has had to move to Novorossiysk. So those are huge successes, but territorially the Ukrainians haven't advanced, and we've gone through that a number of times. But certainly it has shown that the Russians would be a lot more difficult to dislodge, and they still have enough in the tank to do huge offensive maneuvers in Avdiivka, although in so doing taking huge losses. Anyway, he continues, the counteroffensive was Ukraine's last hope for a short, straightforward victory. I broadly agree with that, and proved just how strong these Russian defenses were against an attacking force without much air power, sufficient mine clearing gear, or the skill to conduct combined armed offensives at scale. I would agree certainly with the first 2 points. The third point, you can't do combined arms offenses at scale without the Air Force. So it's kind of a bit harsh to say that. It's like, man, you're really bad at boxing. You're such a bad boxer. Oh, you've got both arms tied behind your back. Well, yeah, of course you're a bad boxer. Like, you can't expect to be a good boxer if someone has bound your hands behind your back, right? What are you going to do? Headbutt them? So, of course it's going to be they don't have the skill to conduct combined arms offences. When one of those prerequisite skills, if you like, or foundations, is air superiority, NATO would never do what was being asked of Ukraine. And so, without air superiority, they don't have that. You ain't going to do combined arms, especially if you're also not being given like ATACMS and the ability to take out these air bases and so on and so forth. So you could succeed with combined arms initiatives if those minefields weren't built, weren't planted, and the fortifications weren't built, and the artillery wasn't so overwhelming. So it's a case of, right, okay, we need to get rid of the minefields, we need to degrade the fortifications, and we need to get rid of the artillery and air defences. Right, we're going to concentrate on those last two particularly, and over several months the Russians have been severely degraded. Of course, it depends how big their artillery stocks are as to how that goes long term. Right. Second, we have all the news from Congress and from the EU about the more and more difficult political struggle to maintain, let alone increase, flows of military aid to Ukraine. Both bodies are being plagued by Ukraine fatigue and dictatorship apologists on the inside. I mean, Viktor Orban just... if these crucial flows of aid stop, particularly the ammunition of 155mm howitzers, mortars, Gimlers, and air defense dry up, it's a simple fact that Ukraine will start to run out of things to fight with, and in turn ways to hold back the Russians from advancing forward. Exactly what I've talked about in the last couple of days, and what Justin Bronk talks about, which is you start with the idea that 80% of casualties take place as a result of artillery ammunition or artillery shelling. And artillery shelling obviously depends on artillery ammunition and the pieces. But if you've got the pieces, fine. You don't have the ammunition, you can't attrit the forces at 80%. You can't attrit the forces at the levels you require in order to stop the Russians from being able to reconstitute, train up troops. What you want is the Russians to lose so many troops that they have to throw their untrained soldiers into the frontline meat grinders. That's what has been happening until, of course, the Ukrainians have started running out again of artillery ammunition, and that gives the Russians a breather. So it's utterly dependent on artillery ammunition. So he continues, unfortunately, it's also hard to see the scope for a decisive Ukrainian advantage in innovation and drone warfare. Russia has switched on and committed resources and is now at least at parity in the drone electronic warfare game, if not ahead. This is a genuine concern that I have. You've heard me talk about this over the last few days. Russians are going onto war footing. They know it's going to be all about drones. Now, the Ukrainians did have that advantage. They had a United 24 army of drones. But with that, they really need significant electronic warfare capabilities. And that's something that Western nations are reticent to give to Ukraine, because that is super sensitive technological knowledge that, A, they don't want getting into the wrong hands, and B, it's so close to, it's where the West has that huge advantage over other nations around the world. It's like, if you've got that much money and technological expertise as America and Europe does in terms of research entities and just sheer volume of cash to throw at this stuff, these nations will have the best electronic warfare stuff in the world, which is absolutely vital to prosecuting a successful war for, say, NATO forces. Well, Ukraine aren't in NATO, although they're kind of fighting on behalf of NATO, but you get this uncomfortable situation where, like, we've got this really valuable stuff. In principle, we really want to give it to you, but actually, of all the things we have, this is our sweetest bit of tech, and not too sure about that. But of course, that's exactly what Ukraine need to prevail. So what we have is that in the space of about 2 months, with an honest look at the political and military situation, we've gone from a scenario of Ukrainian victory versus frozen stalemate to one of frozen stalemate versus a Russian march to victory. In other words, best case scenario, he's implying here, best case scenario is a stalemate. Worst case scenario is the Russians march to victory. That's shifted towards the Russian a Russian success. By the way, stalemate is in quotation marks because just because attacking is hard and the front line isn't moving much, that doesn't mean it's a stalemate. Technically, there's a huge attrition, and the lines on a map don't move, but the capacity of one side over another might change significantly. Fighting is as intense as ever now, and both sides are attriting each other as much as possible with fires. What does that mean for the war and the West's support? For that, you can go back and read the article to sum up. We can't go on like this forever. Whether the war ends with victory or a peace deal, independent Ukraine can only survive if the pressure is put back on Russia. Absolutely. One thing I didn't mention there, which is important to add, Western support is critical, but it is only one of two key parts of the defense of Ukraine. The other is Ukraine itself, and their cracks are beginning to show as well. I don't get into the Zelensky-Zelensky conflict, but it is real and it is worrying. I believe the return of political competition in Ukraine and the influence of internal politics on battlefield strategy will be one of the greatest dangers to Ukraine over 2024. So it's an interesting point that, political challenge in a free and fair democratic nation is really healthy. What you want is one political party being undermined by the other, or one politician being undermined by the other in this kind of fight. It's to see what you're made of, what you really believe, what your ideologies are, and how you appeal to us as the electorate. In war, that is counterproductive. You want absolute unity, and if there is genuinely this situation where there are people vying for power internally in Ukraine, that will be counterproductive. Add to that the increasing levels, he says, of social disengagement from the war. Crowdfunding donations are down. Life in Kyiv looks as if there is no war, etc. And increasing social and economic strife caused by the need to mobilize more young and not so young men. I hope it's clear that this isn't me dooming for fun. It's keeping contact with reality, a complete reality which doesn't have inconvenient pieces missing from it. I look forward to the time when my work will not constantly be called sobering. Until then, for as long as the guys I meet on the front keep on fighting with a smile on their face, we'll do our best to do the same. And that speaks for all of us at the Kyiv Independent. This is, no one said it's not challenging. This is hugely challenging. This is a country at war. This is a country that has much smaller resources than Russia, is a much smaller country geographically. All those natural resources, but all the resources of personnel that Russia can bring to bear vastly dwarf Ukraine. And so therefore it is incumbent upon other nations to help Ukraine. And it's in our best interest to do so. And I keep talking about this the last couple of days. I've been banging on about this consistently, but it is just so important. And I think that sets up this Richard Barrons talk really nicely. So Richard Barrons, who is he? He's a retired British Army officer, Commander Joint Forces Command from 2013 to 2016 when he retired in the UK. He's former NATO chappie. This talk that he gives is really good. I've taken off the beginning, and I'm probably going to play it at 1.25 times speed just to speed things up a little bit. If you're listening to me now on sort of 1.25, 1.5, 1.75, he's going to sound like a chipmunk. I'm sorry about that, but I do want to just speed him up a little bit if you don't mind me so doing. Right. Okay, playback speed, 1.25. Not too much, just a little bit.
My objective today is to make you think about the war in Ukraine and make you think about war and its role in the rest of your lives. And if I move half of you, I will count today as successful. I'm going to start with two statements. The first is, the war in Ukraine is a symptom of the strategic confrontation that now exists between us in the West and Russia. We didn't choose it, but we got it.
First thing to say, and I'm going to do a lot of commentary on this. If I just let it play, then it's unfair it's possibly not of fair use, doesn't fall under fair use. So I do need to keep interrupting. It's part of what I have to do. But also, I wanted to give my commentary as well. It's just worth saying that he's speaking to an audience of movers and shakers in Europe who are politicians, businessmen, women, scientists, main people in society and whatnot. So that's who he's speaking to. And he's talking about this idea that actually this isn't a choice, and I mentioned this before. This isn't a choice for allies, right? Of like, should we do this or shouldn't we do this? There is no choice. We have to do this, but that's like the blame for that falls on no other shoulders other than Putin's. Like, Russia have forced us into this situation, which shouldn't be treated as a choice. If you want to continue like living in the existence you're used to, then we need to deal with this.
And winning is as vital for everybody in this room as it is for the young man or woman who froze last night in a hole 3 meters under the ground in Ukraine. And why might that be? Well, that is because Russia decided to invade a democratic country on the fringes of the European Union against its wishes, to extinguish it as a state, to make it part of a return to a greater Russian imperial empire, and to do so knowing that we wouldn't be thrilled. It also is the same country that thinks it's fine to run some of the strongest organized crime gangs in the world at your businesses and your lives, including astonishing cyber capability, and to
This is interesting. He's thinking about his audience. Always think about audience, purpose, task when you're creating content, when you're writing, when you're presenting. It's like, who's my audience? What's my objective? What do I want them to do? I want them to... This is a kind of an alarmist speech, right? I want them to be alarmed, and this is a call to action. This is a call to political and public action in order to shore up militaries around Europe, and to show that politics and the military in Europe have traditionally, or the EU have traditionally, been separated. And lots of people in the UK, when we went for Brexit, lots of leavers were shouting about, we don't want an EU army. But actually, kind of where he's going here is you can't separate politics out from military. And you can talk in terms about, well, the EU was originally an economic community of like a free trade bloc, but actually it's become more than that. And you can talk about, well, one federalized Europe. Do you want that country? Do you want Europe to be like a single country? And we can have that debate. But actually, there's a really interesting discussion to be had around, can you separate military out? Does the EU need either a combined army or a much more centralized handle on military matters?
Interfere in our elections.
So sorry, I was talking about the audience. So what he's doing, though, as well, is saying, right, some of you are businessmen and you might not give a monkeys about what's going on in Ukraine because you're running your business. So I need to talk to you about things that might matter to you, which is organized crime that Russia's running out there, which is disinformation, which can affect you as a businessman, which is cyber hacking, which is cybersecurity, and so on and so forth. So he's appealing to all of these different people in there, and he'll be appealing to scientists in a bit as well, to a degree, and businessmen in something he mentions soon.
Now, if you're okay with that, I'm in the wrong room, but if you're okay with that, then the war in Ukraine is just about Ukraine. If you're not okay with that, then this war and its outcome matters to you.
It's about you.
But even if we were just to have a conversation with Ukraine, I would fall short today, because we need to talk about the new era of existential risk of which this war, which Russia has inflicted on Ukraine and us, is a symptom. And this...
So two things there. One, Russia has inflicted this war on Ukraine and us. So we're in this with Ukraine. You guys, and you guys watching, Russia has committed themselves to a war against you. It might be by proxy, it might be happening somewhere else in a different country, but it is against you. It is against your values. It is against your economy. It is against what you're used to, in terms of your comfort or the costs of thing, or the freedom to, so on and so forth. I think that's really significant. There was something else as well.
I hope this war, which Russia has inflicted on Ukraine and us, is a symptom. And this, I hope, is pretty familiar to most of you. For the rest of your lives, whether you're one of the younger in the room or one of the more senior, your world will be dominated by the confluence and the combination of these four factors. The rise of China, shorthand for the return to great power confrontation in our world. Another shorthand, a clash between liberal democracy, us, and autocratic capitalist China with Russia as a sort of footnote, and a lot of the world looking on and wondering who to back if they need to back anybody. It's not obvious to them that it's you, by the way.
Really interesting. So you guys in this audience, you represent liberal democratic values and liberal democratic nations, liberal in the sense of freedom, not in a political liberal. And these guys are challenging this with their autocracies, China and Russia. And there's going to be a lot of people looking on going, well, I don't know who to back. Now, hopefully you and I can say, well, I know who to back. It ain't going to be an autocracy. Like, how much do you value democracy, guys? Like, that is this idea. It's an existential threat. That's what I was going to say. So he's talking about this is an existential threat to you and to you watching this. This is how important this is.
But we've had great power confrontation in our world before, but never had to do it at a time when our planet can no longer sustain our abuse and expectations and demands of it, particularly as we impose on it a population that will reach around 8 billion by 2050. The instability of climate change, the fact that we know now that we are going to have to accommodate the effects that we have failed to see off, will provide the tableau on which great power confrontation will play out. It will affect all of us and hundreds of millions of people and their lives and their expectations.
This is fascinating, right? And, right, there will be a bunch of you out there who sit probably on a particular part of the political spectrum, who will be there going scoffing at the mention of climate change, denying climate change, or denying that humans are responsible for it, or whatever, right? I had a chat to Greg Terry about this last night. It's really interesting. He's fully on board, and he's fully on board with what he says here. And hear me out now. If you're ever one to question whether climate change is a real thing, whether it's just a hoax, if you are a climate denier, my advice to you is go and check out what the US Department of Defense think about climate change. Go and wonder how fricking seriously the American military take climate change. And then wonder whether that thing with that almost $1 trillion budget, whether they're concerning themselves with just a hoax. If they can't work out it's a hoax, like, how do you think it's a hoax? Don't believe that. I mean, you've seen what Tucker Carlson says about Russia. You've seen what he says about Ukraine. You've seen what he says about Viktor Orban and Hungary. Do you know what? He might be lying to you as well about climate change. So I don't want this to be a big soapbox about climate change, but it's really interesting. This is a core component of what Richard Barrons is saying here. And this is about global stability going forwards. Now, when you go to the US Department of Defense, who are mainly concerned with blowing shit up, right? And building things with huge amounts of with a massive carbon footprint. Actually, they are really deeply concerned about the strategic impact of climate change on the United States, on global stability, and on their role going forward in that very unstable world. Now, Richard Barrons knows this because you guys can all argue about, we can all argue about whether climate change is real and we can go and watch Fox News or we can go and watch MSNBC and we can get in our little tribes. Meanwhile, everyone's doing this, like the adults in the room, and I don't mean this pejoratively, but kind of, I guess maybe I do. The adults in the room are going to go out and say, okay, what's really going on here? Because if we're not prepared for reality, if we don't have a handle on what's actually going on in the world, like, what chance do we have of being prepared for an eventuality that may well come to pass? That is looking like it's coming to pass. So when you go to the US Department of Defense website, you can get a handle on how seriously they are taking climate change. So just the DoD said, the planet's changing climate has a significant effect on the Defense Department missions, plans and installations. DoD is elevating climate change as a national security priority, integrating climate considerations into policies, strategies and partner engagements. And you can go and look at all sorts of stuff on that. and you can look at their goals and their plans, and you can look at flow charts. But I just think this is really interesting, and this goes back to what Richard Barrons is one of these people who are like, yeah, okay, we need to get a handle on this, because actually this is going to really affect how we strategize in the military. If we get it wrong, we're screwed.
And while we're doing those two things, we will have to manage the effects of the digital revolution, a subject that's come up extremely well today. As you know, the digital age is transforming how we live, how we work, how we play, and of course it's going to change how we fight. We'll return to that theme. The innovation that is in the heads of some of you in this room is the key to the way we transform how we fight, which is how we'll secure ourselves. And then there's the fourth thing. We don't
He's talking to the scientists there.
like to talk about nuclear weapons, but since
And
the end of the
businessmen.
Cold War, more people are getting nuclear weapons, more people want them. But the thing that's changed, and you've seen this both in Ukraine and in Gaza, is that some people think it's okay to use a small one. And by small, I mean 15 kiloton.
Tactical nuke.
And the fact is, it's not okay, but it will not necessarily lead to superpower escalation and the end of life on this planet. But those four things. So let's look at a couple of statements again. The first is, most of you, particularly the more senior in the room, you have led your adult lives with this sense that Europe had gone post-conflict. We don't need war anymore. We just decided we were through it. And that somehow we in Europe, and we have a comfortable life, we were guaranteed to increase our prosperity in conditions of great comfort and security, and the world would eventually bend to our way, the inevitable triumph of liberal democracy and market economies. And that's all gone. In my mind, if you want a mouse, and it went when Russia invaded Crimea in 2014. China does not mean the world to work in the way that you would like it to work, and we're having a conversation. You also generally think of yourselves as post-conflict. World War II ended in the last century. Actually, if you look at the nexus of risk I just set out for you, it is much more likely that you are now pre-conflict.
So an interesting way of framing things. Stop thinking that you're post-World War II and think you're pre-World War III, or that's probably a bit doom. You're pre a big conflict. And in fact, you might even say we are in that conflict now.
That's not necessarily about fighting for the territorial integrity of Europe, though Russia, if it could, would make it so. It's much more about protecting your interests for your security, your prosperity, and your values when something like climate change provokes enormous instability and crisis somewhere in a planet which affects directly our lives here. If you think of yourselves as pre-conflict, you're going to take a very different view to how you think about the subject of war. There is no immunity in this. Now, I understand I'm in Switzerland. Switzerland declares neutrality, but in the world I've described, neutrality is not the same as immunity. And for those of us that reach into collective security arrangements, more of which in a minute, we will find that we look after ourselves. We are not necessarily overly generous to those that sit outside the club. Ask Ukraine. And that means if we're going to have a conversation about war and conflict, we need to talk about war. Now, this is on your TV screens there, and normally with an audience I have to explain about the nature of war. The nature of war is an aspect of the human condition, unchanging over the centuries. It is brutal, it is feral, it is irrational, it's disappointing, it's dangerous, it's destructive. It's generally not very successful. But some always find it liberating and glamorous when they haven't experienced it and are tempted by it. It seems to be a cyclical thing. Basic fact is, give someone like me the tools, missiles, cyber, proxies, and a shitload of ammunition, and I will reduce the lovely civilization of any of your countries in about 2 weeks. The power will go off, the water will go away, your welfare systems will collapse, your food supply will collapse. I will make it so. That is war in the raw. And if you want the most graphic example in my whole life, it's in Gaza now. That is war in the raw. You may think you don't want that, you'd be right. You may think you're immune to it in Europe, you'd be wrong. So the nature of war never changes, but the character of war, how it's fought, changes all the time. Of course it does. Circumstances, events, technology, and thinking. And so what might we learn from Ukraine? Well, the first is war. Big wars are fought, won, and lost by you, not me. I'm the professional military. I start the thing off, and then usually I'm wiped out, to be honest. But if you look at what's happening in Ukraine, on both sides of the line is manned by you, by people who 2 years ago had lives like you and expected to have lives like you. So war is about mobilizing civil society and industry. It's a contest of will and capacity and endurance.
Absolutely correct. And all the stuff we've been talking about, which is how many people have you got? How deep are your pockets? What's your economy like? How much ammunition and military equipment can you produce? What happens when you take those workers and send them to the front line and you don't have them to be able to work in the factories and industries we've just been talking about, and so on and so forth. Both sides are struggling with this, and this is where allies need to come and assist Ukraine, because when you look at as he's already mentioned, the comparative size of the economies of Ukraine plus allies and Russia, it's huge. Okay, the allied nations swamp Russian industrial and financial economic capacities. Now, you can talk about Russia getting on side with Russia getting on side with China and maybe some of the BRICS nations. But, aside from that, if they're going to hold themselves off a little bit, really, it's about a mobilization of the Allied support.
That is not, frankly, what is featured in most of your adult lives. For example, I spent a lot of time in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Bosnia, where you send professional militaries away to do discretionary interventions. That era has now passed. Secondly, you're used to talking about the effects of climate change and how you need to be resilient to it, here or anywhere at home. You now need to think about how you are resilient to people who choose to confront you and may occasionally conflict with you. We'll return to that. Thirdly, war is more than weapons. A lot of conversation about artillery, ammunition, and all that kind of thing, but war is about will and industry and people and training and food and communication. It's about innovation. So that's another aspect of how war becomes a whole of society effort. And then the fact is, ask Ukraine, that in this world that we now live in, no European country, no matter how big or small, is going to survive and thrive unless they invest in collective security. Arguably, even the US and China need friends. And we have two vehicles here in Europe. We have NATO, celebrates its 75th anniversary next year, the most successful military alliance ever, although for the last 30 years, frankly, it's been able to be asleep. It's now waking up. NATO is about hard power.
This is very interesting, and I would advise anyone go and watch Barrons' video on NATO and military alliances and how the US, for example, exports security, and it's all part of the US's economic, situation, framework, whatever you want to call it. The US as an entity is deeply involved or has NATO and the Department of Defense as part of its economic and political strategy, its geopolitical strategy. It's not, there are lots of criticisms about NATO, and Trump was, I think he was right to say that other nations need to pay more. But at the same time, there is this argument that actually, even with an imbalance of payments, the US get a lot out of NATO. That is not just like, we have to pay into this thing and it's something we've got to do for some potential future event. Actually, it's keeping the US economy founded on a massive expenditure in the defense and military industrial complex. It's allowing them to export security around the world and get trade deals in return. It's allowing them to export their military hardware around the world, so on and so forth. There's so much more involved in NATO than just this security alliance that we have to commit to spending 2% of our GDP on defense in order to be in it. So it's just more nuanced. But yeah, anyway, he's talked about NATO a little bit.
And Article 5 applies if you're a member of NATO. Ask Ukraine. The European Union, all about soft power, unique in power blocks in the world, is that it chooses not to align political power and military power with its economic strength. Maybe that worked for a while. I don't think that works in the future. Because actually, when we talk about war, there are three constituent things, and they're all integrated, that you have to be good at. You have to be resilient. And there are four parts to resilience. The first is simple physical resilience. Things like infrastructure and port operations and food supply. It has to work, and you have to protect it because people like me know to take it away from you. There's a human dimension, got to keep people safe. That's about hospitals and evacuation and shelters if necessary and drills. That's not hard. I don't think anybody in Europe does that anymore. Maybe I'm wrong. There is a digital element to resilience. Everything we do depends on digital architecture in some way or another. My job is to take that away from you so your phone doesn't function, your industrial control systems don't function, your transport networks don't function, and of course your air defense doesn't work. But the fourth bit of resilience is the most important thing. It's your head. It's cognitive resilience. And for the first time ever in the history of mankind, people like me can make war directly into your head thanks to the phone that you carry. I can tailor a message, I can freak you out, I can inspire you, I can break you.
So important. All of this, it gives you a great understanding of how it all pieces together. But this again talks to the idea that this is a war against us. That's not necessarily Russian soldiers, battering down our doors in Arizona or here in Lucerne or in Oslo. This is the Russian nation invading our minds with disinformation, with narratives that run counter to the ideals that we might hold dear. It's a challenge.
But it's the resilience in your head in this world I'm describing to you that is often the decisive factor. And then there's the bit in the middle. War and confrontation is often about not military stuff. This is hybrid or grace-based or tolerance.
So I just want to go back. I've had so many people commenting after last night's live stream and other videos I've done saying, one this morning saying that I've been having this argument with my father, and he's like a MAGA Republican, and he's thinking we shouldn't support the war and blah blah blah. And you think you can trace that back to what he's talking about here, the battle space in our heads over these narratives, and one narrative is being effectively manipulated or created or funded or dispersed by Russia, and the other narrative is a fight against that, and that is taking place in people's heads. And this guy was saying, look, I'm having this argument with my father. I've got these views, which is this narrative. He's got these views, which is kind of has its foundation in the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg or whatever. I really need some content that will give me the ammunition. We can talk about this in kind of military terms. The ammunition to fight that battle, to fight for one side in that battle in my father's head.
Warfare. It's about assembling all the levers of power short of the use of military force. Some of that is in the public sector, the things governments do, money, ministers making phone calls, development aid, that kind of thing. By far, the greatest power of Europe in hybrid confrontation is in the private sector. It's about banking and law and culture and sport and entertainment and manufacturing and innovation. And most of you are connected to that. Those are the things that make Europe powerful in commerce, in confrontation, and in conflict. And then there is this bit about, of course...
He does several times during this talk, he does a good job of alliteration and rhetorical flourishes that you might not realise or take for granted, but it is, put together.
Digital age is changing how we have armies, navies, and air forces. This is the most significant transformation for 150 years in how you do military stuff. It's about cloud and AI and robotics and autonomy and bioscience and networks and autonomy. There's a very dark side to this, but if you could harness the innovation in this room and in Europe, we would find better, i.e. more effective, cheaper, more sustainably affordable, and exportable ways of resecuring Europe, because we would be on the front edge of this digital transformation. Even if, as was described this morning, quite a lot of the base technology is in the US, the fact is a lot of the innovative thought is here. And this is a competition, because if you were a Chinese audience or a Russian audience, I would be saying the same thing. But there's a choice. So let's circle back round. So the war in Ukraine is about your interests and your security. And let's come down to the issue of the day here, where you get to make a choice. And that is, right now, there are Ukrainian soldiers sitting in trenches, and they'll be there all winter, with not enough ammunition or equipment or training. There's nothing on their shelf. There's nothing left on our shelves. We've given all the stuff that we kept in store. The only way Ukraine wins is if we now mobilize our industry and our will behind that. And do not tell me it's unaffordable, because you represent an economy of 15 trillion euros a year, and I can feed the Ukrainian military on about 75 billion euros a year for 2 or 3 years, and I can make them win. This is not about affordability. This is about choice and competence. And isn't it a bargain if we can defeat Russia's objections to you on a war in Ukraine where you only spend money, you do not spend your children? Bargain of the century.
And that's what, we showed you last night, and I've showed you before. So sorry to show that to you for a third time, but I think it's so poignant.
And then it's going to take us to this. And this is where I'd like to leave you. If there's a dinner party question for the rest of this week, it's this. So we talk about war in Ukraine. We talk about the business of war. We talk about existential risk. And all of you in this room are leaders. But actually, if you think about it, if you extend what I'm saying to you, you are leading humanity when humanity may sit on the edge of extinction for these reasons. First of all, we've always fought for things that only exist in our heads, religions, political philosophies, name it. We believe these things we invent to be true, to be eternal, to be universal, and to be exclusive. We fight with people over their choice of headwear, many other things. That's been true forever. It's true now. But what's different is we're now beginning to fight with weapons in the digital age. We've always had nuclear weapons, but now with artificial intelligence, we're going to start to create weapons that we don't fully understand, we may not necessarily control, but they could take control and wipe us out. And when we do that, we'll be doing it on a collapsing planet that can't tolerate our abuse and expectations, and we can no longer fix problems by moving in a world of 8 billion people, or consuming stuff we've dug out of the ground and throwing it away in the way we fixed our problems for millennia. That doesn't work anymore. And in the middle of that dilemma of we fight to the death for the things that we invent, with weapons we don't understand that could destroy us.
As an interesting aside that you could take here, which is precisely why there are humans now looking at mining on asteroids and astro mining. It's like, well, we've exhausted all the stuff here, so we might as well go somewhere else and dig some stuff up. Interesting discussion to be had about that.
On a planet that's giving up on us is us. And maybe we forget we're animals. That everyone in this room shares 98% of their DNA with the chimpanzee and the bonobo, and the 2% is what has created all of this. The 2% split the atom, gave us the internet, and then stuffed it with cat videos and pornography. It's a blessing. And the 2% allows us to be brilliant but also flawed. But we need to remember the 98%, we're not very good at being generous. We're not very good at being tolerant. We're not very good at sacrificing consumption now for warding off putative future peril. And we much prefer, if sacrifices are to be made, that somebody else we don't know, somewhere else in the world, should make it.
And there's a massive conversation in UK. He's touched on a really interesting part of human nature and morality called delayed gratification. That there's some really fascinating. The Walter Mischel experiments to do with the cookies or the marshmallow, where you go to a 5-year-old kid. Look, I'm going to give you this cookie now, but I'm going to go away, and if that cookie's still there when I get back, go away for 10 minutes or whatever it is, you'll get 2 cookies. So can the child delay their gratification in order to get a reward at the end? And actually that's been replicated a bunch of times, and it's also been followed longitudinally in lots of different contexts. And the children who can delay their gratification are the children that achieve loads more life successes going forward. But a lot of children, and therefore a lot of adults, are not very good at delayed gratification. I've got one of each children. I've got twins, and one of them would absolutely not be able to not eat that cookie straight away. I'd just be like, yeah, I don't care, I'm eating that now. Unable to do that delayed gratification, which then when you look at putting in loads of effort to get this reward at the end, loads of effort now for that to delay my gratification so I can get this reward and get a gold medal here or some massive life success over here. I just don't have the tools to do that, but some people do, and that's kind of what he's talking about. Are we able to put the effort in now to think about the rewards down the line? And the problem with politics is it's not very good at doing delayed gratification, because it exists on either a 2 or a 4 year cycle most often. And if it's existing on that smaller cycle, then it's almost in the DNA of these political mechanisms that you don't do long-term thinking. Like if you're only going for it, but of course, if you have a long term, it means that you can end up being a really bad politician getting in, and then you've got a 10-year term of this like really bad. So there are these trade offs there. But America's got an interesting situation. I keep talking about this, where the House of Representatives rule, they have a 2-year term, and the senators have a 6-year term, like a third of them go every 2 years, and that's an interesting kind of marrying of those two, and you can actually see a bit of benefit of having this longer term and shorter term thinking going together. But even 6, when you're talking about like spending tax dollars to get a gain for your country that is 20 to 30 to 50 years down the line, you're going to have an awful lot of people in that country going, why the hell are we spending my tax dollars that could go to me right now, right, in some kind of service benefit? Why are we spending that on like 50 years down the line? And of course, that then unfortunately invalidates long-term thinking, which is very short-termism. And I don't know what the solutions to that are, because in our individual lives we're not particularly good at that. I mean, some people are very good at delaying their gratification, but even when we are individually good at delaying gratification, we're doing that for us, right? But if we're doing it as a nation, we're doing it for our nation, and it's like, well, that's not me, that's our nation 50 years down the line. I'll be dead by then. So, do you know what I mean? These are real challenges.
If you bundle all of that together, ask yourself, 100 years from now, will there still be a Lucerne dialogue, or will there be left the smoking ruins of an Earth that's run by the ants and the rats, because we, Homo sapiens, we were not up to that? I think it's a 50-50 bet. Now, you may choose to ignore me, but choosing not to choose, choosing not to decide, choosing not to act is a decision of itself, and I can't put it better than that. Branka, thank you very much.
I thought that's really interesting, and it's more like a starting point to like, oh, where do we go from here type thing. He's not necessarily providing answers, but it's kind of a wake up call to like, okay, these are our challenges. How do we all work together? And the interesting asides you can have, or maybe they're not even asides. It's kind of where he wants the discussion to go, which is you guys as the EU, like, can you separate the military out from the economic when actually they're necessarily integrated? When you will have to go to war, you need to draw on your economy, you will need to draw on your science, you need to draw on human resources. So can the EU make these political moves that might involve military without an integrated military? I think that's a really interesting discussion. I've never been against like European military at all, because I think, well, you got NATO, you got the UN, and we commit to that, and we commit troops to that. And to me, it was like, I know a lot of people like going, oh my God, an EU armed forces, like, well, it's just a group of countries getting together to a common end. So it kind of makes sense. But anyway, like, I'm sure most of you will disagree with me, but yeah, there's a lot of interest in there, and I'm sorry it's just me like randomly stopping and going off on one. I mean, I didn't plan any of this. Like, everything I said was just off the cuff. So apologies if it is a bit stream of consciousness, but that's the nature of everything I do. Yeah, I'd be interested to see what you guys think about some of those ideas that came out of that. And next time we'll look at Justin Bronk's interview. Just as I know it's been going on for too long now, but just here's the last thing I'm going to show you is I saw this ages ago. It's doing the rounds again. This is you can tell because it's in the summer. This is a gift from Sweden. I think, is it herring? Fermented herring. So it's a gift from Sweden. It's like, I thought you guys were supposed to be allies. Just, yeah. Let me know, my fellow Swedes out there. It's sped up in places. Oh, it's actually been sick. Fermented herring's not going to be my thing. Let me know if that is a justified ending to that video, specifically if you are Swedish. Thanks very much for watching. Please take care. Speak to you soon. Toodle pips.